Heather Johnston, thanks for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline. I'm here in Jerusalem. You're there in California at the time. But major things that are happening here in the Middle East and around the world. One of the main things here happening in Israel is the change of a new government. Naftali Bennett is Israel's new prime minister. The iconic prime minister for many years, more than any other prime minister in Israel's history, Benjamin Netanyahu, is no longer in office right now. But you know Naftali Bennett, you know some of the members of this new government. Tell us about them and tell us what you think God is doing in this shakeup here in Israel.
Well, thank you, Chris, for having me. And it is such a wild time, isn't it? In Israel and really around the world. But I think the new government is a timing thing. It seems like, that God would at some point need to look to a new government, a new generation to be able to bring up and to get into place. And so while we have this extraordinary lion-hearted prime minister in Netanyahu, a scholar, probably the most brilliant expert on the Middle East that is possible, has strategic depth, it would seem that the shaky part of this is God having to make a transition to a new generation. And I think Naftali Bennett is brilliant. He is not just brilliant in business, where he sold two of his businesses for 135 million, 150 million in his 30s, but he has had a real penchant to be in the political realm since he's been in his 30s. And so he had a great mentor in Mayor Ron Nachman, who was the leading mayor of Samaria. He understands the dynamics of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and he's a little bit of a step to the right of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his conservative views and even his values. I think that it's a rocky road. It's a wide government with a lot of disparate parties. As you know, they may not be able to hold on to it, but it would just seem that Israel may be exactly in that generational shift. And I think Naftali and Gideon Sar, who's the new justice minister, are great friends of mine. And I have nothing but wonderful things to say about them. They've got a ways to go in getting a strategic depth view of the world and the Middle East and all of those things, but I believe they'll get there.
One of the other major things that are happening here in the Middle East is what they call the Abraham Accords, signed at the end of last year. Many people that have been involved in that. Tell us what you think about the Abraham Accords and what changes does this bode for the Middle East?
Well, I was actually at the White House on the lawn on the signing of these the first two Abraham Accords, and I walked away just knowing that Israel had changed overnight, had become stronger. And I think that these Abraham Sunni Arab nations need Israel. And Israel needs these nations in the face of a threat with Iran and in going into the future to create a huge staging ground in the Middle East for trade and diplomatic relations and possibilities. So I think these things were anticipated by God. We've been leading tours. I've been leading the congressional senior leadership tours to Israel for years now, a decade. And part of the teaching that we go through is just understanding that in the rebuilding of the nation of Israel, the kings are going to come. The nations are going to actually come into Israel. They're going to be foster fathers. They're going to be nursing mothers. They're going to play a role. They're going to seek trade. I sat with Prime Minister Netanyahu just a few years ago and went literally through a Bible study with him and showed him the verses. And he's like, these are these for today? And I said, well, there's no reason not to think that they're not for today, that the kings will come and they will rebuild your walls. The foreigners are going to serve you, and you're going to be in a time where people are going to seek you out, for technological advances, artificial intelligence, all those things that in which you've risen to greatness. The kings are going to come to the brightness of your rising. So I believe that these are a fulfillment. These Abraham Accords fulfill some of those Isaiah prophecies or at least are at the beginnings of doing that. I think we can understand that that's what that is. So, but the Abraham Accords more practically certainly have opened up new possibilities for the United States and Israel. It is an extraordinary, probably the most significant milestone of the U.S. administration under Donald Trump, certainly the feat of their administration. So I think we've got a huge frontier to be able to see a lot happen on, and it's to be anticipated.
Major changes politically, geopolitically, politically with a new government, geopolitically with the Abraham Accords, but also the rise of adversaries. And a lot of people are concerned about the rise of China. And one effort I know you're aware of is trying to take pharmaceuticals and that out of China and perhaps here in the Middle East. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that the United States would, across the board, with bipartisan support in Congress, would understand that China is an existential threat. And, whereas President Obama in 2012 encouraged our involvement in China, including Israel, obviously those days have changed. And it has become apparent that we want to see Israel wean themselves off of China. China has come into Israel in a very dynamic way. They've got incredible infrastructure projects that they've been handed with, port in Haifa and tunnels under, the city of Haifa. And it's extraordinary how they've made their way and their tentacles into Israel. And so the United States is concerned about that. And then, of course, the pharmaceutical life sciences is primary. The United States American interest today is to think, how can we reduce our dependency there? How do we can nearshore our life sciences and pharmaceutical companies? And so the House Energy and Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over the CDC and over the FDA, and they are really examining how to incentivize U.S. private industry out of China and into Israel. And so we have led some of the briefings for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Energy and Commerce, to bring to bear some of those key leading pharmaceutical giants that are related to the Middle East, and to show why there's an advantage of U.S. companies moving out of China and her tributaries, and why moving and setting up their resource centers in Israel, their production in Israel, and even in the UAE and some of these Arab Abraham Accord nations. So this is really being looked at. I believe it's the hottest topic on Capitol Hill today. It is a problem to solve. And I believe the Congress over time is going to figure this out, a way to spread out and get our pharmaceutical and life sciences into the hands of our allies.
Yeah, and that was brought to importance so much during the coronavirus pandemic, when many of those pharmaceuticals actually came from China. And also CBN News just did a story on the digital currency that China is developing right now, which is really alarming, not only for people in China, but also the rest of the world. And as you said, it's a hot topic on Capitol Hill. You're involved in Capitol Hill with many of the congressmen and women. You're also involved on the hills of Samaria, which J.H. Israel. And we've had at CBN News the privilege of reporting on that throughout the years. There's an amazing phenomenon there on the hills of Samaria. Tell us why you've been involved in that, you and Bruce and the J.H. Israel team, for many years. Why is this such a special endeavor?
Well, I think that we have always had our eyes on what is it that God is doing? Where is he working inside the nation of Israel? When we first had that call 23 years ago to try to find how can we be relevant and find our place there to do what would be helpful. And so we kind of stumbled around, but what we began to really understand that as was prophesied by Ezekiel, particularly chapter 36, there's a real chronological process, almost like Ezekiel 36 is a microcosm of biblical prophecies, but it follows a real succession. And I think that one of the prophecies that we really believed was up and coming 20 years ago would be that if God's going to rebuild the cities and reestablish Samaria, then he's going to also fulfill that big blanket promise that I'm going to take out the heart of stone out of this nation. I'm going to give them a heart of flesh and put a new spirit where they're going to be able to come and find me in a personal way. And I think that was where we set sail to build the National Leadership Center as a staging ground in Samaria. And follow up to that, Jeremiah 31 prophesies that during those days of Israel's restoration, he's going to send the Gentiles, the Nazarene, to the mountains of Samaria. And they're going to say to Israel, come, let's go up to the Lord our God. Well, what in the world was what was Jeremiah seeing back in captivity, but Gentiles showing up in Samaria with a keen interest to validate Israel's identity, to be able to come in and play a major role in seeing that untenable secularism move out, and let's go up to the Lord our God. So that's what we've done. We've built a national leadership as the staging ground. We've had 85,000 young people go through the training there. If you can imagine coming into Samaria on buses to go through leadership training in discovering their life's purpose, how to relate to God, how to understand themselves and be able to relate to the other, which is really essentially what leadership is. So we are now working in the schools of Israel. What I would say is that we have watched in the last 10 years, Chris, a major sea change in the culture of Israel. The Ministry of Education is playing that dominant role in educating all the children of Israel. Every family is involved there. That's where the sea change is taking place. To lose your story, your biblical story, is to lose your identity. To be a stranger to God is to be a stranger to yourself. And there's that realization from the top of the country all the way down to the municipality level that Israel has to have a keen, deep understanding of who they really are in order to be a light to the nations, in order to be able to have this next generation really flourish inside the state of Israel.
It's just like rediscovering their roots. What impact do you see that happening on many of the thousands of Israelis that come to JH Israel?
Well, they're coming to the National Leadership Center. JH Israel supports that National Leadership Center. We've helped write content with the Ministry of Education and all of that. We've played an underpinning of support. But the National Leadership Center is playing that role where when people show up, they're encountering the presence of God. They're climbing on ropes courses. They're going through a real tactical process, almost like an IDF type experience, but they're reflecting on the life of King David, Joshua, Caleb, kind of your major leaders out of the Bible. And they're putting themselves in their shoes. They're saying, how did this person relate to God? How did they really come to know who they were? And then how did they relate to larger Israel? And so they're actually going through a personal process of transformation. A lot of healing takes place there. As you open the Bible for the very first time in your life and start to read it, it's powerful. You know, the sword of God, the Bible is like a sword. It goes in sort of like an axe for the frozen sea within you. And it has played that role in the National Leadership Center.
Wow. Well, as I said, I've seen it in action. It's an amazing place. So you've written curriculum for that. You've also written a book called Uncommon Favor, The Intentional Life of a Disciple. Tell us why you wrote this book.
Well, I wrote it because I think we've been in a journey for the last 23 years that has been nothing short of miraculous. I think that what we came into Israel to do is to serve, to play a hidden role, to find where we could be relevant and support to what was going on. We have had the opportunity to be able to watch and even play a role in helping facilitate some of these unfolding prophecies. We've been right in the middle of it. And so I just wanted to give an eyewitness account to some of those things. So the book is a narrative, but it also, in the process of calling each person to a personal review of what it really means to be a disciple of Jesus, it harkens back to that first century rabbi-talmid relationship, the talmid being the disciple under a rabbi, what it really meant. What did Jesus really mean by becoming a disciple of his? And then it sort of leads you through a process into some personal decisions about who you want to become. And Chris, I wrote it in the middle of COVID-19. We couldn't be in a more chaotic, convulsing world where there's been great loss in people's private life. There's a loss of identity. There's grief. There's loss of life. There's been a great sense of ambiguity in relationships. People have been forced into technology to try to have relationships. So this book comes at a good time to review identity, personal identity, and to make some personal decisions. I wrote it also because I believe a disciple is one who is hooked into the larger purposes of God. They're involved in that which is transforming society. And so the importance today in our very chaotic and impersonal world, and even including mega churches where we come to church and we can't figure out where we belong, we are standing at a time where more important than ever to find that tribe of yours, that group of people that are inside the mountains of society affecting change, and to make sure you're situated there with a group of disciples who are making an impact, whether in your nation or you're being called to another nation. A great example is being hooked into these unfolding prophecies over Israel, understanding them in our day, and how they can have a reverberating effect back on our nation.
Well, you've certainly been involved in many of these prophetic unfoldings here in Israel and the U.S. As a disciple. Heather, give us a 30,000-foot view of where you think the U.S. is, Israel, and the world in large.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it feels, if you look at it, Chris, it feels like we are barreling toward the last days, doesn't it? I've always taken a very conservative view of that, because being inside the unfolding prophecies of Israel, you see how long it takes just for one thing to happen, and that you can't speak conclusively that it already did happen. So you have to look at things with real circumspect in that way. But the 30,000 view is that we're in a time of great harvest. We are in a time where we're being called individually to step up our responsibilities, to take a more active role in transforming society. And I think as people do that, we will see a change in our world. There were 12 disciples that went out, and believe you me, they transformed the society of their day. They made the big dent. They were able to do something that was so consequential that it literally affected, generations to come. Abraham did the same thing. We have that opportunity as well. U.S.-Israel relations, I think, is strong. Even with a new administration there, we have got a strong Congress relating to Israel. We've got challenges ahead of us, but I think that the collaboration has so many fronts now with which to grow, from artificial intelligence, continuing missile defense, integrated business between Palestinians and Israelis. We've been able to see a lot of roads lift up for a robust U.S.-Israel relationship.
Yeah, speaking of the U.S.-Israel relationship, you have a tour coming up for congressmen and women here in Israel and up to the hills of Samaria. Tell us about that visit, and why is this relationship so important?
Yes, I believe that what we want to do, if you can kind of think of a strategic aim of the United States, it would be certainly to get the Congress to Israel. What happens, though, often is that they'll fly over on a one-day Codel tour, meet with the prime minister, and fly back. Our trips are highly geared towards education and really bringing them in to meet with the experts, not just the top officials, which we do, but to meet with the experts in the area of those collaborative points on missile defense, on the Middle East peace conflict. So we take them through Judea and Samaria to meet with the Palestinian leaders as well as the Israeli leaders, and to really understand the peace process, because for so long the U.S. would not let Congress come into Judea and Samaria. We were allowed. It was actually outlawed. You couldn't do it. So we've been able to bring those tours through there and provide some real important education so that they can go back and make informed decisions. What you want Congress to do is to take an active leadership role. because regardless of who the president is of the United States, whether we have a Barack Obama who was not so friendly, or we have a President Trump who's the best friend of Israel, Congress plays a steady leveraging role. And that's why these trips, these advanced education trips that we're taking are so important. They're going to take a real strong look at artificial intelligence, the life sciences, all of those things will be included on our trip.
Yeah, going back to the Abraham Accords, tell us about some of the miracles during the Trump administration and some of the stories that you had to tell.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the big stories, I woke up one morning in 2009 and I heard the Lord say to me, I want you to lead the Congress through Israel, particularly Judea and Samaria. And I'm going to raise up the U.S.-Israel collaboration to another level. Well, I mean, he might as well have given that word to my 4-year-old granddaughter. It was so out of reach, and I was not involved in government at all. But I had a great mentor in Mayor Ron Nachman, and so it took 2 years. You kind of sometimes hear the Lord speak to you, and you just let the word flap in the wind, hoping it'll snap free. That's exactly what I thought about that word. But it eventually came stronger, and so I kind of wrote out on a piece of paper what I thought the 4 objectives would be in bringing Congress to Israel, what it needed to be for advanced senior leaders. And through a series of real miraculous steps, I ended up sitting in front of Eric Cantor. If you all remember him, he was the highest ranking Jewish official in the United States at the time, the majority leader of the Congress. And he had been looking for somebody to lead these tours. So I just walked in and we just had a match that was kind of made in heaven. And he said, I can't even believe this. I'm going to populate your tours. So we set sail from there. And I think the most shocking thing that happened, Chris, was on our very first tour to Israel in 2011. And, sometimes as a disciple, you show up, but you don't know what in the world you're doing. That's what this felt like. And I knew some of the things we were supposed to be doing. I was leading tours. We had built the National Leadership Center, had been in Samaria and the West Bank for 10 years. So there were certain things I knew, but boy, did I have a dropping off point. And I'll never forget Doug Lamborn, pulling on my shirt and saying, we have got to go see Israel's Iron Dome. Nobody has seen it yet. And it was just the new and upcoming situation. And I thought to myself, oh my word, how am I going to achieve that? We ended up in the office of the prime minister, and he looked at me at the end of the meeting with the Congress, and he asked me a question, and I diverted his question and said, do you think that we could go see Iron Dome? We've got the senior leadership of the Armed Services Committee here. Nobody's seen it yet. And I kind of put him on the spot. So he agreed right there to declassify Iron Dome. So we found ourselves in this van going over rocks and boulders, trying to get out to go see an Iron Dome installation the following day. And all I could think about is the foreigners will rebuild your walls, O Israel. The kings are going to serve you. And it was just beautiful because Doug Lamborn went on with these 5 members of Congress to return back to DC, and they created the legislation that tripled the budget for Iron Dome, which was able to get the Iron Dome installations, not just on the borders, but now in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and all over the nation of Israel. It was only a year and a half later that Israel went into an egregious attack from Hamas, and they were protected by Iron Dome. But it took that long to get all of that in place from the U.S. Congress, the collaboration with Israel, and then to literally get the money to do all of that. Wow. So we've played a major role in that. That was my first trip to Israel, and we went through Judea and Samaria and got legislation opened up there as well. So these tours and these trips are so important inside the U.S.-Israel collaboration, for sure.
Yeah, well, the Iron Dome has just been in use in the last several weeks. I saw it in action myself. It's an amazing technology that really has saved so many Israelis and also Palestinian lives. Heather, kol hakavod, as they say over here, with great respect of all the things you've been involved in, whether on Capitol Hill, the hills of Samaria, JH Israel, and all in your new book, Kol hakavod, and great to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.